A girl came to report the case, saying that her parents were murdered. When the police arrived at the scene, they only saw her parents' bodies. The girl was clean and tidy, huddled in the corner of the house. Not long after, they received another call to report the case. "Police, my husband was murdered." The police immediately went to the scene. This time they saw the husband's body again. The girl was still clean and unharmed, trembling in the corner. Chapter 1. 2011. After leaving the orphanage, this was the first time police Zhang met Kha Man again. When the police arrived at the Fei family's villa, the scene before their eyes was so strange. Even after many years of being a police investigator, he couldn't help but get goosebumps. In the large living room, Fei's parents and two sons were suspended in midair. Their faces were covered in purple spots, their eyes wide open, rolling back ferociously. From the perspective of police officer Zhang, the pupils only occupied a small part, as if their eyes were looking at a nameless realm, silently observing something. In addition to the hanging corpses, there was another person in the villa, that was Kha Man's husband, also the son of the Fei family. His body was full of wounds from sharp objects, bleeding too much leading to death. At the scene, the police found a piece of blood-stained paper. Analyzing from a logical perspective, it seemed that the victim had written something to hint at the murderer when he was near death. Picked up the piece of paper, the police saw a name on it, Kha Man. At this time, there was a reply, "It's me." The colleague Lu Feng, beside her, called out. Kha Man immediately stood up to answer. "Police, have you found any clues?" "Temporarily, yes. Your name appeared in your husband's handwriting, before he died." On the night of the tragedy, the entire Fei family was murdered, but Kha Man, who was in the same villa, was not hurt at all. When faced with the police's questioning, Kha Man said that she was sleeping too soundly and had no idea what had happened. This unreasonable answer was hard not to arouse suspicion. "I didn't kill. I didn't kill. I didn't." Kha Man suddenly hugged herself, panicked, shook her head repeatedly. Her mental state was extremely abnormal. Seeing this, Lu Feng stepped forward to comfort her, gently patting her on the shoulder. Policeman Chenli also pulled Policeman Zhang back, whispering, "Brother Zhang, why are you asking this now? Isn't it too urgent?" Policeman Zhang rubbed the back of his neck, smiled awkwardly, and didn't answer. There was really no way to force Kha Man to confess, but he didn't expect her reaction to be like this. Normally, she was the only survivor. Without solid evidence, she couldn't be accused of being the murderer. But the actual situation is much more complicated than imagined. The Fei family is a wealthy family. In 1996, Mr. Fei founded a high-end jewelry brand in Europe, which was very popular with the nobility. Later, for some reasons, he gave up his career and recently returned to the country. At the crime scene, there were no signs of theft of valuable assets, so the possibility of murder and robbery is very low. The only possibility is personal enmity. The Fei family's villa is located in a luxury area. The land price is very expensive, but at the same time it is also an ideal place to escape. However, the crime scene investigation team did not find any suspicious traces around the villa area. This means that the murderer is still in the villa. Police officer Zhang took out a mint candy from his pocket, the cool taste spreading, making his mind more clear. His eyes turned to Lu Feng and the poor girl who was still trembling, and he couldn't help but recall the scene at the orphanage years ago, when the little girl held on to his sleeve tightly and refused to let go. He sighed, hoping that things weren't as he thought. After leaving some policemen to continue searching for clues at the scene, Tran Loi took Kha Man to the police station to take a statement. During the process, the police discovered that Kha Man's memory seemed to be very poor, or perhaps she had completely misremembered. "No, you're wrong. My husband's father is just an ordinary retired old man, not a jewelry businessman at all. My husband's brother also only does small business in the surrounding areas, and has never been abroad. As for my husband, we studied together since college, got married right after graduation, Wait a minute." Tran Loi interrupted her, then took out the investigation documents. "According to our investigation, Mr. Fei went abroad in 1996 to develop his business, and his two sons have also lived in Europe until now, and have never returned. Not only that, not long after she left the orphanage, she received financial help from Mr. Fay. This help was not short-term. After that, thanks to Mr. Fay, she was able to study abroad and became the daughter-in-law of the Fay family. Mr. Fay also introduced her to work at the family company. Tran Loy showed Kha Man the documents related to the Fay family's financial support and immigration records, then handed the documents to her. Ms. Kha Man, please answer truthfully. Kha Man held the documents, her face suddenly pale. Impossible. I've never received any help, and I've never met them before I got married. Officer, you must be mistaken. Officer Zhang asked softly, Kha Man, do you remember the time we talked at the orphanage? Hearing this, Kha Man raised her head, her eyes blankly looking at him as if she was examining him. Have we met before? Policeman Zhang smiled slightly, slowly recounting the first time they met when Kha Man was 11 years old. When the story ended, Kha Man was still confused, not understanding anything. The police remembered wrong. When I was 3 years old I lived in an orphanage. I had never met any policeman. This answer shocked everyone, but Policeman Zhang was sure that he had not remembered wrongly. Kha Man's clear eyes did not look like she was lying at all. Brother Zhang, did you find anything? What did you find? He was rubbing his forehead, raising his head to ask. In Mr. Fay's office, there was a document that fell into the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall. Lu Feng checked carefully and found out. After saying that, Tran Loy took out a medical record. The file was yellowed, the paper was soft, and it had clearly been flipped through many times. After reading it, Police Officer Truong temporarily left Kha Man with his other colleagues so they could continue questioning. According to this medical document, Mr. Fay is a professional psychologist who does not publicly diagnose and treat patients, and only treats one patient, that is Kha Man. The file records her treatment process. As he spoke, Tran Loy pointed to a section in the document, treatment by hypnosis. Has Kha Man been hypnotized? The document shows that, based on Mr. Fay's diagnosis, it seems that Kha Man has experienced a painful event in the past. So he used hypnosis to help her forget that memory. Recalling Kha Man's strange reactions before, Police Officer Truong shook his head slightly. Perhaps this therapy was not simply erasing memories, but completely changing them. Is hypnosis that powerful? He couldn't help but be surprised. Hypnosis has a long history, dating back to ancient Egypt, and was later studied in depth in Europe. Mr. Fay is a European doctor, so it's not strange that he applies advanced therapies. However, changing memories through multiple levels of hypnosis is truly terrifying. This is a double-edged sword, and if not used properly, it can cause serious consequences. It is powerful, but it also has side effects, Tran Loy continued. Hypnosis has caused Kha Man to have a severe nervous breakdown, often having psychological problems and easily losing control of her emotions. So what? Neurosis and mental disorders. The reason is very consistent with Kha Man's current state. Her claim that she slept too soundly was also mentioned in the medical documents. In order to improve her mental state, Mr. Fay adjusted the hypnosis, allowing her to sleep more deeply. This proves that Kha Man was not lying. On the night of the murder, she may have been in an unconscious state, incapable of committing a crime, and her strange actions were all due to her psychological state. In other words, can all suspicions about Kha Man be cleared? Based on initial speculation, the murderer may still be hiding in the villa. However, the police guarding the scene did not find any suspicious signs. After careful consideration, the police suggested that Kha Man stay at the station temporarily to ensure her safety, but she firmly refused. I want to go home. Go home. You have no right to detain me. The Fay family case was very serious and complicated, but without enough evidence, the police could not detain her for more than the prescribed 24 hours. In the end, they had to send someone to protect her. From a rational perspective, if someone possessed superior abilities, would they be willing to hide it? If Mr. Fay really only used hypnosis to treat illnesses, why did he only focus on Kha Man without asking for help from other experts? What if he had used his hypnotic abilities to do something else? In addition, when examining Mr. Phi's body, the forensics did not find any signs of abnormal health. This further confirmed that Mr. Phi was completely in trouble. Because the case had too many confusing points, the investigation team decided to contact the international police to learn more about the Phi family when they were in Europe, as well as what Kha Man had experienced during her time studying abroad. While waiting for information from the international police, Tran Loi leaned against the tea table and asked, "Mr. Truong, you met Kha Man at the orphanage, what happened? Did you two know each other before?" Tran Loi was a teammate with good chemistry and sharp intuition. Seeing him ask, Police Officer Truong did not hide it. "Well, you can consider us acquaintances. When I first transferred to the investigation team, my first case was also related to Kha Man. That year was 1996, Kha Man was only 11 years old. The girl called the police, saying that her parents were murdered. When the police arrived at the scene, they only found the bodies of her parents. After questioning, the girl said that her mother sold her father fought with her mother to protect her, and in the end, both of them died." This statement matched the whip marks on the girl's sleeve. An 11-year-old child was so skinny that she looked like she was only 7 to 8 years old. Neighbors also confirmed that the girl was often abused by her parents. Kha Man's parents, in order to avoid quarrels in front of their daughter, decided to live separately. However, her mother insisted that her father was keeping a mistress outside, so she turned Kha Man into a binding rope every time she used a whip to beat Kha Man to force him to return home. Kha Man's mother was indeed successful, but this only made the relationship between the two worse. They argued and fought, and eventually led to Kha Man's father asking for a divorce. After that, her mother did the most terrible thing in her life. According to the neighbors, this action was truly inhuman. She priced Kha Man, collected money in installments, and gave her to a widower in the village. When he returned, Father Kha saw Kha Man crying so hard that his lungs were torn. He immediately rushed over with a sickle. In the end, although the widower did not commit the depraved act, this incident completely ignited Father Kha's anger. He rushed into a fight with her mother, and both of them died in that fight. Sigh, parents like that, why drag their children into this pain? Tran Loi also had a daughter. After hearing about Kha Man's situation, he couldn't help but frown, his voice carrying a bit of a choked feeling. Policeman Truong patted him on the shoulder. "That's right, children are so innocent." But what Truong didn't tell Tran Loi was that he had planned to adopt Kha Man. That year, when he told her the truth about her parents, she didn't react at first. But when their bodies were taken away, she suddenly grabbed his sleeve. "Uncle, do I no longer have parents?" Facing those clear eyes, he nodded honestly. Immediately after, her tears fell. As the body was carried further away, the little girl cried, punching the air, hugging her skinny body tightly, and sobbing unceasingly. At that moment, he decided to adopt her. But in the end, he realized that he couldn't. Their jobs, those of the police, were always busy and dangerous. They couldn't stay with her for long. So he took her to the orphanage. At least there, she had the mothers in the orphanage to take care of her long term. When saying goodbye, he said, "Do anything, don't be ashamed of yourself. If you encounter difficulties, come find Uncle Truong, I will try my best to help you." After that, he also secretly visited a few times. Discovering that Kha Man was very smart, the teachers in the orphanage all praised her for being good and studious. At that time, he was extremely grateful for his right decision. If the story hadn't become complicated later, he probably wouldn't have regretted not bringing her back. Chapter 2. The next day, an email from the international police arrived. The investigation results showed that Kha Man had been sponsored by Mr. Phi. After that, she went to Europe to work as an assistant for Mr. Phi, and was introduced by him to become a jewelry painter for his company. European aristocrats were very fond of jewelry, and were also extremely picky. Therefore, they often hired painters to redraw images of the precious jewelry they wore as souvenirs. Kha Man, with her outstanding painting talent, quickly became the most favored painter by aristocrats. At first, everything was going well, until one day, after completing a painting, she suddenly disappeared. Everyone searched everywhere, but it seemed like she had evaporated from the world. Mr. Fai tried to find her everywhere, but to no avail. When he almost gave up hope, Kha Man returned. She wore a torn dress, her body was covered in paint and blood, and her body was covered in bruises and scars. The email also stated clearly, during the time she was missing, Kha Man had undergone unimaginable torture. Reading this, police officers Truong and Tran Loi both felt a chill down their spines, and cold sweat poured out. Afterwards, Kha Man's spirit was completely disturbed, and she even had a tendency to self-harm. Mr. Fai used hypnosis to stabilize her emotions, and at the same time contacted the police to put the perpetrator, Charles, in prison. Charles was a noble with royal relatives. To convict him, Mr. Fai had to ask for help from the international police, and with his influence in Europe, Charles was finally convicted. But because of this, Mr. Fai offended the Charles family and was forced to return home. Currently, the investigators suspect that the murderer may be someone from the Charles family, because the grudge between them originated from Kha Man, and there is no way this family will let it go. The security of the Fai family's villa is being tightened, but we cannot be subjective. More importantly, we need to find the murderer. The only person who can provide effective clues is Kha Man. But will she agree to receive psychological treatment to recover those painful memories? The police both hope that she will help bring the murderer to light, and hope that she can forget the past and live a new life. However, they do not have the right to force her to receive treatment. After discussion, Tran Loi and his teammates finally decided to let Lu Fuan take the lead, and find a way to ask the patient's opinion according to the law. If Kha Man agrees, they will investigate other clues without any complaints. The good news is that everything is going smoothly. If Mr. Fai has sacrificed so much, we will definitely find the culprit. The whole team agreed. After conveying Kha Man's condition, the doctor concluded that the treatment process might cause her to have a stress reaction. Therefore, it would be best to conduct it in a familiar environment. So they arranged for the doctor to be sent to Fai's villa. After the doctor arrived, Officer Zhang took out a piece of candy as usual. Chenli leaned against the corner of the wall, lit a cigarette, and sneered, "What candy? Eat too much and be careful of getting diabetes." Officer Zhang did not respond, only indifferently looking around the villa. Suddenly a question flashed in his mind: why is such a large villa not equipped with surveillance cameras? Chenli raised his eyebrows, appearing indifferent. This is a high-end residential area, the people here are all rich, the security system is top-notch. Who would dare to come in here and steal? Before he could finish speaking, Chenli suddenly turned around. Policeman Truong also pondered and nodded in agreement. Since 2003, China began to popularize the surveillance camera system, and by 2010, it had almost covered the whole country. This luxurious villa must have been fully equipped with cameras, because this was basic for high-end areas. But why was there not a single camera around the Fai family villa? The villa originally had no servants. This was explained as creating the best environment for Kha Man's treatment. But if it was for her, then it was even more necessary to install cameras to ensure safety. What if someone from the Charles family came looking for her, or if Kha Man fell ill and ran away, wouldn't it be even more dangerous? Perhaps, because Kha Man's tragic story was too heartbreaking, it caused them to be blinded by compassion. But looking back now, suspicions were growing. While the doctor was treating Kha Man, Tran Loi went to ask the residential area management. The Fai family villa? There were cameras installed around it at first, but after Mr. Fai realized he was being watched, he asked to remove all the cameras around him. To ensure safety, we objected, but he was adamant, so in the end we could only increase the number of night patrols. Just because of the request, all the cameras were removed? Although this was Mr. Fai, a famous and strange person, this did not sound reasonable. After that, Tran Loi asked to extract all the surveillance cameras in the area. When the case first happened, they had also investigated it, but due to the limited observation range, they did not obtain any clues. The Fai family villa was located in the deepest part of the residential area, almost avoiding the entire surveillance system, which was very strange. Mr. Fai had not returned to the country for long, so the murderer had most likely been following him since he first appeared in this area. Therefore, Tran Loy requested to check each person who entered the area, comparing it with the records of visitors to the villa. As a result, no suspect was found, but Kha Man's unusual actions were found. According to the manager, Kha Man rarely went out, but once, she walked around the residential area for a long time, then suddenly disappeared. Strangely, the location she passed through fell right into a blind spot of the surveillance system, and this only lasted a few minutes. To clarify, Tran Loy asked the security guard in the area to provide more information. At that time, the camera in that area was broken. We only discovered it when we checked later and replaced the camera with a new one. Hearing this, Tran Loy was not satisfied, and asked, "Is the surveillance system here regularly maintained?" "Of course, we always check regularly. Even if there is a small sign, we will replace it immediately. This is the first time something like this has happened." Tran Loy frowned, feeling as if all the clues were inexplicably broken. At this moment, his phone rang. Lu Feng reported, "Captain Truong, Kha Man is awake." Kha Man woke up, sitting in the living room. The sunset shone through the glass door, illuminating her face. Kha Man smiled vaguely, but her eyes were cold as ice. For some reason, seeing that scene, Tran Loy suddenly felt like he was a criminal. He stopped, feeling as if his legs weighed 1,000 pounds. Policeman Truong stepped forward, put his hand on his shoulder, then looked at Kha Man. "She is our most important witness, right?" Kha Man nodded, but did not answer, his eyes fixed on the painting hanging on the wall. Seeing this, Tran Loy walked closer, seeming to have discovered something. It was a painting. In the corner of the painting was a signature. The handwriting was quite special, but the two words, Kha Man, were very clear. He remembered that Kha Man had previously studied criminal investigation, but in the end, she switched to art. She really has a talent for art. As he spoke, Tran Loy looked at Kha Man. "Did you draw it?" "Of course, those eyes look so real." Kha Man remained silent, her eyes still on the painting on the wall, the corners of her eyes slightly red. "It's okay if you don't want to talk." Everyone understood the reason why she was so emotional. But the case couldn't be left unresolved. If they didn't directly touch the final layer of truth, no one could end everything. Thinking so, Tran Loy decided to go straight to the point. "Miss Kha, we've contacted the International Police Force. They said that Mr. Phi had to flee to Europe because he offended the Charles family. We currently suspect that the murderer may be related to the Charles family. Please tell us in detail what happened." Hearing that, Lu Feng quickly turned on the camera, while Tran Loy took out his notebook to prepare to take notes. "The Charles family?" Kha Man raised her head and smiled faintly. "Just a bunch of demons in human form." "What did you say?" Kha Man looked straight at Tran Loy, her eyes sharp as knives. "Your international police force has been fooled." "Fooled? What do you mean?" Lu Feng asked in surprise. Actually, this statement was not too surprising. From the beginning, the International Police Report email had many loopholes. Mr. Phi could live comfortably abroad, he was definitely not a simple person. Considering his relationship with Kha Man, he had absolutely no reason to help her so wholeheartedly. Moreover, the investigation team had never suspected the International Police Force before. But the coordination between countries could be limited, and it was possible that the information they provided had been manipulated by the Charles family. Now that the email was proven to be fake, the direction of the investigation became clearer. "Miss Kha, please tell the truth. What exactly happened?" Kha Man raised her head, her eyes absent-mindedly looking at the painting on the wall, as if looking through it to face herself. "The truth must have started a long time ago. Kha Man said that she grew up in an orphanage. The orphanage's biggest sponsor was Mr. Phi. Thanks to his help, the orphanage was renovated and expanded, and the children were provided with better meals and adequate learning opportunities. To encourage the children to study hard, Mr. Phi also introduced an elite program. Based on their academic performance, he divided the children into groups, then sent them to different schools. Kha Man had always had excellent academic performance, but she was always placed in the average group. This made her wonder, but she did not dare to ask. Being able to go to school was already a great blessing, she shouldn't ask for anything more. As time passed, Kha Man grew up and was sent to study abroad in Europe by Mr. Phi. At first, she refused, but after his gentle but reasonable persuasion, she finally agreed. In Europe, Kha Man studied art under the guidance of a teacher called Little Mr. Phi, Mr. Phi's son. This man was polite, always wore silver-rimmed glasses, and often had a fleeting smile when he spoke. At first, everything went very normally. But after a while, Kha Man realized something strange. In the art class, most of her classmates had very similar facial features, especially their strangely big round eyes. This made her shiver. Not long after, Kha Man was arranged to be an intern at Little Mr. Phi's company. He was very good at capturing talent, and quickly helped her advance. Kha Man was assigned to a large project, serving a wealthy client. She remembered very clearly that the first time she met the client was wearing a rare jade necklace, red as blood. Looking at the necklace, Kha Man felt something was wrong, her body suddenly felt uncomfortable. After that incident, she went to the hospital for a checkup, but found no problem. The company continued to expand, and Kha Man increasingly felt herself being drawn into suspicious transactions. She gradually realized that the expensive jewelry the company created was not just ordinary goods, they had some kind of dark meaning. Phi Ton once said that she had done a portrait for him. Hearing this, she was stunned for a moment. In her memory, there seemed to be such an event, but for some reason, the memory of this incident was strangely vague. Anyway, if it was over, there should be nothing to worry about. And so I started my portrait work. Our clients were very diverse, businessmen, teachers, drivers. But the most special were the nobles, sometimes even members of the royal family. They paid very well, and each portrait was meticulously invested. There was one strange thing: after each painting was finished, the customers came to buy a piece of jewelry from our company's collection. Life went on like that. Although I sometimes felt something was wrong, I still tried to ignore it. Until I met Phi Ton again. In my memory, that was the first time I met Phi Ton, but somehow I felt like we had met many times before. When I met him, I greeted him very naturally, even calling his name. Immediately, his eyes turned cold, as if I had just touched some deep fear. Then, he pulled me into the office, holding some strange tools, and started muttering incomprehensible words. Soon, I realized that I couldn't control myself, as if I was being manipulated by Fei Qing. I didn't remember anything, only that every word and action of his caused my consciousness to gradually be erased. When I tried to struggle, he suddenly stopped, smiled faintly, and patted my shoulder. "Okay, just get to work. In just a little while, you will forget everything today." After saying that, my memory of the incident immediately became vague, as if it had never happened. Later, I learned that he had used a special type of hypnosis, causing the hypnotized person to never remember his appearance, as well as the process of interaction between the two. It was like there was a magic eraser, erasing old memories and replacing them with a new story. But I didn't forget. At that time, my consciousness was still very clear, it was just that my body was completely controlled. It can be said that Phi Ton's hypnosis no longer had a full effect on me, like a drug that my body had developed resistance to. Phi Ton, Mr. Phi's son, was a doctor, but his personality was truly terrifying and perverted. After meeting Phi Ton again, I began to realize more unusual things. Why did he give false information to the world? And why did he use hypnosis on me? The fragments of my memory made me shiver. Recalling a series of strange events before, I decided to report to the police. But before I could escape the hypnosis, another terrible thing happened. I was like a puppet being pulled by strings. Although my consciousness was completely awake, all my actions were not according to my will. I felt like my personality and body were being robbed, like being possessed. I tried to fight, but everything was in vain. Until I met Claire, Duke Claire, the first client I ever painted a portrait of. Duke Claire was a powerful figure in Europe, equivalent to an ancient lord. After completing the portrait, I immediately went to see him, begging for help. But the truth was, Claire was just an accomplice. Claire looked at me with cold eyes, then ordered someone to lock the door. I was forced. I tried to struggle, but it was all in vain. He smiled with satisfaction, his eyes burning with excitement like a predator. Finally, when he was tired of playing, he tore my dress, pushed me down, and raped me. I screamed, begging for mercy, but all fell into the void. In my despair, my handbag suddenly shook. Claire frowned, her eyes flashing with anger. He grabbed my neck, making me unable to scream anymore. But thanks to that phone call, I had a chance to escape. Not long after, Fei Qing appeared. I thought that maybe he would save me, but in the end it was all just an act. Fei Qing used his familiar hypnosis technique, trying to erase all my memories of that event. But I did not forget. After escaping that room, I took a shower, changed into a new dress, and stood in front of the mirror. I tied my hair up, looked in the mirror and saw myself smiling, but my eyes were red from crying too much. Through the mirror, I saw Fei Qing and dupe Claire talking in the next room. They laughed and talked like old friends, or perfect partners. At that moment, I finally understood the secret of the Fei family. Ever since Mr. Fei sponsored the orphanage, it was all a trap. The elite program was just an excuse to select qualified tools, big round eyes, slim figures, different from Europeans, which the aristocracy especially liked. Studying fine arts and becoming portrait painters was just a way to get us into their hands. We were like products on an assembly line. First, they selected the raw materials, then processed them, and finally put them on the shelves to be displayed and sold. The only difference was that we were not bought, but only rented. Those expensive jewelry were only rented. Fragments of memories gradually returned. It turned out that in most of the previous cases, I had been hypnotized after being violated. Only this time, because Claire wanted to try something unusual, images of each face flashed through my mind. There was a beautiful, charming face, there was a gentle, shy face, there was an arrogant, defiant face, and also had a face of extreme pain. The memories that had been sealed by Phi Ton were reawakened. Based on the needs of each buyer, we were transformed into different models. The memory returned to the first time I painted a portrait. At that time I drew a transparent pearl, but it turned out to contain the blood of a virgin. I couldn't help but tremble. With fear and disgust in my heart, I tried every way to expose their crimes, but all were in vain. Claire, along with the protection of the royal family and nobles, had turned the entire Fei Qing operating system into an impregnable empire. One day, by chance, I met the international police. I knew that only they could help me. At that time I was still under the influence of Fei Qing's hypnosis. My consciousness was restrained, and I could barely move or speak as I wished. But when I saw the international police, I struggled, signaling for help. Luckily, I finally succeeded. But at this moment, Fei Qing appeared. He held me back, faced the international police, and calmly made up a story. "Sorry, officer. My girlfriend has been seriously ill recently and is mentally unstable. I will take her back to rest immediately." After that incident, Fei Qing realized that he could no longer completely control me. Fearing that I would cause big trouble, he decided to send me back to the country. Of course, this decision did not come entirely from Fei Qing. The nobles behind Claire also felt uneasy. For the nobles, family honor was of utmost importance. If these crimes were exposed to the common people, it would be a disgrace worse than death. Claire had wanted to take advantage of the European legal system to cover up her actions, but once the case involved international issues, the international police had the right to investigate further. Therefore, Claire and the people behind her begged Fei Qing to leave Europe. In return, Claire even convinced a member of the royal family to grant the Charles family the title of Earl for life, on the condition that Charles would take the blame for them. For that reason I was molested by Charles, and Fei Qing played the hero who saved the beauty. When the news spread, the original fake story became the truth to the public. After returning home, Fei Qing prepared every precaution. He used hypnosis to erase my memories of what happened in Europe, leaving only the memories he had arranged, but I was always a difficult problem for him. They even asked to dismantle the entire surveillance camera system in the villa, just because they were afraid that I would reveal something. To prevent risks, Fei Qing also registered my marriage with me, and at the same time forged medical records, creating a diagnosis report that I had schizophrenia. If the police were suspicious of the medical records, the international police would only have access to the documents that Claire had carefully prepared. Their plan was so tight that it left no room for error. Chapter 4. After Kha Man finished her story, we all felt extremely shocked, even cold. From the staging at the orphanage, to the training of portrait painters, everything had been calculated a long time ago. If what the Phi family had achieved was like that, then the price they had to pay was definitely no less great. Kha Man was not the only child at the orphanage. There was also not just one orphanage, and the number of victims was certainly much greater than that. How many lives had these crimes destroyed in the end? Looking at Kha Man, she still kept a calm expression, as if she was telling someone else's story. However, in those eyes, I still saw the pain that could not be relieved. I asked further, so after that, you killed Phi Ton's father? My words were more like an affirmation than a question. Kha Man's answer not only confirmed my hypothesis, but also matched all the evidence that had been tested. Kha Man had killed Mr. Phi. This conclusion was further confirmed by the experiment of his colleagues. They recreated Kha Man's every move in the area without surveillance cameras. In the space of only a few minutes, it was true that Kha Man had not met anyone during that time. The clues were clear, the culprit could only be one person. No. Suddenly turning back, holding his hand tightly, saying, "Police, I didn't kill anyone, it's just." The word suddenly stopped. Then, his face was full of horror, his eyes staring blankly, like a bottomless pit. Finally, as if he had just realized something, he let out a cold smile. Laughing and crying at the same time, his charming face was covered in tears. Finally, he only uttered one sentence, "It's just a very terrible dream." I never gave up on escaping them, but except for that time, I never saw any signs again. After returning to the country, I began to be hypnotized to disrupt my nerves. Almost every day I was in a state of confusion. At that moment, I thought everything would end like that. Perhaps he had relented. Suddenly waking up, I realized that the bondage was no longer present. Feeling both happy and scared. This kind of luxurious freedom definitely could not last long, wanting to escape, but afraid of not being able to escape. At the moment, everyone was silent for a moment. Lu Feng quietly put away the camera. Tran Loi lowered his head to look at the leather notebook in his hand. Police officer Truong slowly stood up, but was pulled back by Kha Man turning his head. He saw red eyes, tears welling up. He tried to struggle, but she wouldn't let go. His hand was clenched so tightly that it hurt, and tears fell down his back, bringing with them a burning sensation. Her eyes stared at him, as if he was the only ray of hope reflected in the depths of her eyes. Kha Man closed her eyes, her heart aching. He suddenly thought, if he hadn't sent her to the orphanage that year, what would have happened? If he had chosen to send her away, she would definitely be like him in the past, studying hard, entering the police academy, and becoming a defender of justice. But in the end, she didn't become a police officer. Therefore, as a police officer, obeying the law is the only principle. He turned away, untying his fingers one by one, then walked away. His footsteps grew farther and farther away, followed by intermittent sobs. He couldn't help but continue walking. Chapter 5. At the villa, she immediately reported the entire case. After listening, the superior pondered, then became angry. Immediately dispatched a support team, requesting an investigation of all orphanages with signs of abuse in the country. Must investigate the list of victims and those sent abroad. Contact the European Police Commander, request support from immigration agencies and international police to repatriate the victims. Comply with the request, then present the handling of Kha Man. The initial answer was, "We must wait for the results of the investigation, then the court will decide." Because Kha Man had provided clues, she received special treatment. She was temporarily detained at the Phi family villa, with someone supervising, waiting until the investigation was completed. Although it cannot be solved completely, following the professional regulations is the only thing that can be done. The only thing that can help Kha Man is to go to each orphanage involved, thereby making merit and hoping that her confession will help reduce her sentence. During that time, Tran Loi continuously moved between locations, and finally found more clues. It turned out that Phi Lao called himself an elite educator. In addition to choosing from Europe, he also selected children with excellent achievements for systematic training. But the purpose of that training was not simply education. Most of these excellent students passed the entrance exams to 985 and 211 schools, and some even received invitations from prestigious international schools. However, their achievements were used by Phi Lao to build his reputation. Add to that the charitable donations and generous help after natural disasters, and no one could link these admirable actions to such a dark and horrifying transaction. That is also the reason why, even though the incident was discovered in Europe, Elder Fei still dared to return to the country. After contacting the commander, the police immediately investigated the related staff and victims. Yesterday, the European police escorted the victims back to the country. Claire, for affecting the friendly relations between the two countries, was expelled from the royal family. Other related staff were also severely punished. Tran Loi led the team to welcome the victims back. After the medical professionals treated them, they began to take statements and compile records. The removal of hypnosis was also a very technical job. From behind the glass, Truong watched the doctors work, witnessing the victims' expressions as if they had just been revived. But after a while, he still didn't understand the whole process. He sighed inwardly. Each profession was indeed a different area of expertise. After finishing the treatment, Truong quickly handed the tea to the doctor. "Thank you very much, Dr. Muck, thank you very much." Dr. Muck took it and smiled. Treating and saving people is the right thing to do. If you want to thank them, thank Police Officer Truong. You guys solved this case and saved many innocent people. Dr. Muck, you're too polite. If you don't cure Kha Man, how can we have a smooth ride? Cure Kha Man? I didn't cure her. Dr. Muck shook his head, denying it. From the moment you found Kha Man in Fei's villa, she didn't have any illness. Lu Feng was hypnotized and lost her memory, but there were no signs of hypnosis on Kha Man. She was faking her illness? I'm not sure if she was faking it or not, but she was completely normal at that time, without any psychological symptoms. Boom. Like a tower collapsing in James' mind. He had to lean against the wall, his mood in turmoil. Kha Man didn't have any illness, so why did she pretend? If she had never been hypnotized, why did she run away from Fei's house? If she didn't forget anything, then why did she lie? Is she really a victim? If not, what was her role in the incident in Europe? The questions that seemed to have been answered now became more complicated than ever, making Zhang confused. He immediately called his subordinates and asked them to take Kha Man back to Fei's villa. But the other end of the line had already reported the news. Old Zhang, Kha Man ran away. Chapter 5. Can't remember how he rushed to Fei's villa. All the victims were brought back, the related orphanages were being investigated, and according to the plan, Kha Man had been considered for a reduced sentence. But before he could announce this news, she had already fled with a false statement. If she really had her own troubles, they could help her find a lawyer to defend her. So, what was her secret? The forensic examination showed that the victim was murdered. However, the villa had been thoroughly inspected, there were no signs of a fight, and the police team monitoring the villa had not found any suspicious suspects. Things became complicated and mysterious. Taking out a mint candy from his pocket, he just put it in his mouth when Tran Loi ran over and shouted loudly. "Old Zhang, look at this." Old Zhang handed over a bloody photo. According to common observation, the victim often left behind a clue related to the murderer before dying. Holding the photo, his eyes immediately caught sight of a name, Kha Man. He was startled. The mint flavor spread in his mouth, but it seemed unable to ease the feeling of shock. Quickly taking the photo to the recording board, he remembered that in one of Kha Man's sketches, there was a signature in the corner. Carefully comparing the handwriting, he discovered that they were completely different. Holding the photo tightly, he felt a heavy feeling pressing down on his chest. He rushed out, leading the team to search every corner around the villa. Night gradually fell, but they still found nothing. How strange, we were on guard the whole time, so how did the murderer escape? Not even a trace. Could it be that the murderer hasn't left the villa? Are you crazy? How could that be? Yes, how could that be? But could it be that the murderer is still in the villa? Chapter 6. Although he had provided many important clues to help solve the Phi family case and the incident in Europe, was the real murderer Kha Man, and where did she go? It was like someone who had never existed but was always present right next to them. How should I describe it? I thought I was standing in a position that covered the whole situation, but perhaps that person was from a higher perspective. That person appeared and disappeared, like something untouchable. A year later, a female corpse was found floating in the river. After investigation, the girl's identity was confirmed. It was Kha Man. When he heard that police officer Truong had come to look at the body for a long time, a deep regret arose in his mind. He whispered, "Sorry, Kha Man." That same year, the country began to implement the fingerprint registration system into the resident information. From January 1, 2012, this system officially went into operation. After the fingerprint system was implemented, the efficiency of the police in solving cases increased significantly, and the work also became more streamlined. This was a good sign. In his spare time, Truong often took out Man's false confession to study, hoping to find clues. But every time it was in vain. "Old Truong, my daughter just won first place in the exam, let's invite you to celebrate tonight." "Okay, let me take a break today." Putting the statement back in the file, he left the police station. As he walked, he didn't notice a girl standing next to him. The two of them bumped into each other, documents falling all over the ground. He bent down to pick up the documents, apologizing repeatedly. The girl also sat down to help, and during that time, he saw an ID card. "Did you just come back from Europe?" he asked. "Yes, officer. My passport has expired, so I stopped by to renew it and update my fingerprints." After saying that, the girl looked at her watch. "The administrative staff left half an hour ago, I should probably come back another day." He nodded, smiled lightly, and then said goodbye to her and left. Truong walked away, but when he looked back, the girl was still standing in the same place. He waved his hand, calling out loudly, "Hey, let's go home." She did not reply. In the brilliant sunset, when he had disappeared, the girl slowly raised her hand, smiled, and waved slightly into the air. It seemed that from afar, a gentle reply echoed, "Yes, goodbye Uncle Truong."